It's August 6, 2024. A small collective of around 300 Ukrainian troops crossed the border into Russia's Kursk region, and the war between Russia and Ukraine was changed forever. Those soldiers were the first of many who would flood over the northeastern border of Ukraine with Russia, taking territory and transforming the war. The Kursk invasion marked a monumental shift in strategy for Ukraine. For over 2.5 years, the country had dedicated itself to a valiant defense of its borders, throwing everything it had at stopping the Russian front line from pushing further in. Now it was on the offensive, an attack that reminded Russian President Vladimir Putin that Russia is far from the only country capable of invading another. To say Putin was taken by surprise would be an understatement. Humiliated by the Kursk invasion, he had to face up to the fact that he had failed to protect his homeland while bombarding another country. Even as of this script's writing, 500 square miles of Kursk are still in Ukrainian hands, with Putin's promised response of 30,000 soldiers to repel the invaders either yet to materialize or being incapable of shifting the Ukrainians from their new position. Still, at least Putin could console himself with the thought that this would be the only Ukrainian invasion of Russian territory. The element of surprise had worked well once, but he would be prepared if Ukraine tried to do it again. All he has to do now is push Ukraine's forces out of Kursk, and he can get back to war as normal. Putin wouldn't be fooled again, surely. He would, and he has been, as Ukraine is following up the Kursk invasion with a second invasion that will see it take as much territory in Russia as Putin's forces hold in Ukraine. So, how did this all start? Reports started surfacing of an invasion into Belgorod on August 27, 2024, with multiple outlets appearing to confirm it had happened. One of those outlets was Times Radio, a British radio station hosted by the Times news media outlet, which invited former British military intelligence officer Philip Ingram onto the show to discuss the attacks. He revealed what we knew as of August 27th. What we know so far is that the Ukrainians seem to have attacked with 300 troops into one border crossing, and there are unconfirmed reports of another 200 troops in another border crossing point. This would put the total invading Ukrainian force at around 500, which is similar to the 300 or so that was initially reported for the Kursk invasion. In that case, the 300 or so, backed by armored vehicles and tanks, were quickly able to overwhelm the border checkpoints leading into Kursk, opening the way for more Ukrainian troops to pour into the Russian oblast. Perhaps Zelensky is hoping to repeat that success by using a small contingent to blow the border checkpoints leading into Belgorod to clear the way for more troops to enter. That remains to be seen. Other news outlets offer conflicting reports. On August 27th, the Kyiv Post reported that the pro-Kremlin Telegram channel shot that 60 Ukrainian soldiers, along with 8 armored vehicles, had launched an invasion operation near the Belgorod village of Nertivka at 8 a.m. That was followed by a report by the MASH Telegram channel, which refuted these claims and said that it was more like 200 Ukrainian troops moving with several infantry vehicles. The same Telegram channel also notes that a further 300 Ukrainians were fighting with Russian soldiers at Shabikino, which is one of the border checkpoints into Belgorod previously mentioned. These MASH reports seem to align more closely with the numbers Ingram quotes, with the likelihood being that the shot channel either has inaccurate information or was attempting to downplay the invasion due to its links to the Kremlin. Either way, confusion reigned, just as it did when Ukraine invaded Kursk. Vyacheslav Gladkov, who serves as the Belgorod Oblast's regional governor, quickly took to Telegram to try to downplay the talk of an invasion. Information has emerged that the enemy is trying to break through the border of the Belgorod region. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, the situation at the border remains difficult but under control. Later on, that control was demonstrated when Gladkov posted a Telegram message saying that Ukraine had started to conduct shelling and drone attacks on 3 villages in the Belgorod Oblast. Some of that shelling took place in Petrovka, which is 6 miles away from the Neotivka checkpoint, suggesting that Ukraine had broken through the checkpoints and was in the process of capturing territory. If you remember the early days of the Kursk invasion, you might already notice some parallels. An invading force of around 300 or maybe more, and Russian claims that the situation was under control even as it became clear that Ukraine was breaking through. Of course, the reality was much different, with Ukraine ending up entering Kursk easily before it began a rampage of territory taking that has seen it firmly entrench itself in Russian territory. Perhaps we're about to see the same in Belgorod. Reuters also reported on the developing Belgorod invasion noting that it wasn't able to independently verify any of the reports found on Telegram. However, it did quote a Russian military blog named Operation Z, which has 1.6 million subscribers, as claiming there had been no real Ukrainian attempt to break through. There were clashes with Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups, and Russian artillery is working, the blog claimed. No large-scale attempts to break through have been recorded. Perhaps not. But then the Kursk invasion wasn't large-scale, at least at first, and Operation Z's claims seem to directly conflict with Glodkov's confirmation that Ukraine had launched shelling and drone attacks on several villages in Belgorod. So the situation remains unclear, but it seems likely that Ukraine has at least attempted to enter Belgorod, with some other reports suggesting that it succeeded to some extent. As Ingram points out, what we might be seeing right now is Phase 2 of a wider invasion effort, with Kursk being Phase 1. That's designed to allow Ukraine to capture at least as much territory in Russia as Russia holds in Ukraine. But here's the most notable thing. This latest invasion is far from the first time that Ukraine has attacked Belgorod. In May 2023, The Guardian reported on a Russian warplane dropping a bomb on a busy city. That sort of occurrence has sadly become commonplace during the Ukraine war. The bomb exploded successfully, leaving a 65-foot crater, while ripping up the sending debris flying in all directions. It was such a powerful blast that it launched a car onto the roof of a shop, though the strike ultimately ended up killing no one. But there was something different about this bomb. Yes, it had been dropped from a Russian plane, but the bomb, which was launched on April 21, 2023, struck a Russian city, Belgorod. About a month after dropping that bomb, the reason for the Russian warplane being used was made clear. May 22, 2023, saw two Russian rebel groups, the Russian Volunteer Corps, or RVC, and the Freedom of Russia Legion, or FRL, launch a cross-border raid from Ukraine into Belgorod. Both are pro-Ukrainian groups, with the raid supposedly resulting in them taking control of several settlements near the border, before they were ultimately driven out by Russian government forces. Similar raids took place in June 2023, which the RVC dubbed as the second phase of its efforts, a phase that saw them being joined by the Terror Battalion out of Belarus, with the goal of the raid being to draw Russian soldiers away from other parts of the Ukraine war's front lines, while inspiring a spirit of rebellion against Putin. The craziest thing is that the May and June 2023 invasions carried out by Russian rebel groups aren't the only warning shots that have been fired in Belgorod's direction. May 6, 2024, brought with it news of a Ukrainian air attack on the Belgorod region that left 7 people dead and a further 35 people injured. Glodkov claimed that the attack involved the use of drones, with the target apparently being a meat production facility in the village of Berezovka. That strike followed one that took place in December 2023, which killed 25 and injured a further 100 in the oblast's main city of Belgorod. Point here is that Putin has seen a Belgorod invasion happen before, and yet he was still clearly unprepared for the August 2024 invasion. Ukraine has made it clear, time and again, that Belgorod is a target. Yet Putin was caught with his pants down by the latest invasion, with the failure of his border checkpoints to keep several hundred Ukrainian invaders at bay, resulting in several of the region's villages being forced to endure shelling and drone strikes. So we come to a question. Why is Ukraine targeting Belgorod? A possible answer may lie in the region's importance to Russia. AP News reports that Belgorod is an oblast that shares a 335-mile border with Ukraine. The region is characterized by farmlands and rolling hills, with its population of 1.5 million being spread over 10,500 square miles. But perhaps crucially, Belgorod is also home to several major Russian industrial companies, with the region producing around 40% of the iron ore that Russia uses to forge its war machine. Perhaps Ukrainian attempts to take Belgorod are designed to cut off Russian access to its iron, as well as the food produced by Belgorod's farmlands. If nothing else, Ukraine invading deeper into the oblast will allow it to disrupt the logistics needed to transport these goods to the rest of Russia, placing Putin further into a material crisis that's already seen him pull World War II-era tanks out of storage to continue his Ukraine. However, to create that disruption, Ukraine would have to take a substantial amount of Belgorod, certainly more than the 500 or so troops believed to have taken part in the border crossings would be capable of taking. So, a far more likely reason for the Belgorod invasion is that Ukraine is looking to expand its influence within Russia by taking yet more territory out of Putin's hands. That's according to Ingram, who tells Times Radio that he believes Ukraine is trying to use Belgorod, along with Kursk, to establish a buffer zone on its northern borders that it can later use to negotiate with Russia. What seems to be happening, and I'm speculating a little here with a lack of information, is that the Ukrainians are going to try to take over a sort of buffer zone inside Russia along its northern border, claims Ingram. That buffer zone will ideally equate to the same amount of territory Russia holds in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's forces are already making good progress in that regard. As of September 4, 2024, Ukraine holds around 386 square miles of territory inside Kursk. There are no reports yet of how much territory it's taken in Belgorod, though the fact that it's launched several attacks on villages 6 miles away from near Tivka suggests that the number may be close to 400 square miles. Let's compare that to Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine. Following his initial failed attempt to take Kiev in a smash-and-grab raid, after which his forces were pushed back substantially, Putin has settled into waging a war of attrition. Territorial gains have been slow, but they have come, albeit on the back of a meat grinder that's Russia lose over 620,000 soldiers, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. 2.5 years of fighting has seen Russia take control of around 18% of Ukraine, which amounts to nearly 42,000 square miles. Perhaps that means Ingram's claims of Ukraine attempting to take an equivalent amount of territory in Russia that Russia holds in Ukraine are a little ambitious. However, his comments make more sense when you consider Russia's gains throughout 2024. Much of the territory Putin holds is territory his forces captured during the early months of the war. Since then, progress has been slow. For instance, Reuters reports that Russia has seized just 211 square miles of Ukraine between January and the beginning of May 2024. For those keeping score, that's about half of what Ukraine has seized in just 1 month of its invasion of Russia. So Zelensky is showing that his forces can make equivalent or better progress than Putin's in a much shorter time frame, with the clear threat being that Ukraine can take even more territory to create the buffer zone Ingram references. Why would having this buffer zone matter? There are 2 reasons. First, Kursk and Belgorod haven't been chosen for the Ukrainian invasion simply because they're border regions that Ukraine can enter easily. Both the regions that Ukraine believes have been responsible for launching missile and shelling attacks on Ukrainian cities, meaning taking territory in those or blasts, would make it harder for Russia to attack Ukraine from the north. Hence the buffer zone. By maintaining this zone, Ukraine keeps Russia further away from its northern lands, perhaps enabling it to place a greater focus on defending Donetsk that's been Putin's clear target throughout 2024 and for much of 23. The second reason comes down to negotiation. As Ingram points out in his interview with Times Radio, that could be Zelensky's endgame. Ingram says Zelensky may use the Belgorod and Kursk invasions to turn around and say, "You've got some of my stuff, and I've got some of your stuff. We either agree to keep what we've got, or we agree to give it back." In other words, Zelensky may use the territory Ukraine has captured in Kursk and Belgorod to create a trade with Putin. That trade won't result in Putin giving up the full 18% of the territory Russia currently holds in Ukraine. But if Zelensky can regain the several hundred square miles Ukraine has lost since the beginning of 2024, he's achieved a massive coup. All of Russia's losses so far this year would have been for nothing. And if the trade doesn't go through, Zelensky can dedicate more Ukrainian resources to the invasion, capturing even more Russian territory while placing even greater pressure on Putin. And pressure brings us to another of the reasons why Ukraine is invading Belgorod. With this second invasion, Ukraine piles on the pressure Putin is facing in the wake of the Kursk invasion. That pressure is starting to come from his own people, who are being forced to confront the realities of what war with Ukraine looks like when that war is brought to their doorstep. On August 14th, just 13 days before Ukraine's Belgorod invasion, the region was already placed under a state of emergency. At the time, Gladkov claimed that Ukrainian attacks meant that houses are destroyed. Civilians died and were injured. Though the veracity of these claims is what isn't in question is that Putin is already facing backlash from his citizens over the whole affair. We can see this in Kursk. On August 8th, just 2 days after Ukraine invaded the oblast, CNN reported on several residents in Kursk's Sudansky district sending pleading messages to Putin via telegram. The address features several people, one of whom claimed that the statements being released by Russia's Ministry of Defense about the invasion were false. "These lies enable the local residents to die," said the resident. The chief of the general staff recently told you the situation is under control. But today, huge, furious battles are underway in the Sudansky and Koronevsky districts, they claimed. Another resident kept it simpler. Sudsa was attacked, turned into ruins in a matter of hours. Local administration wasn't working. Reading between the lines of these messages, we can see that Putin's citizens are losing faith in him. Those in Kursk who've experienced the full force of Ukraine's fury are not only terrified, but being forced to deal with Putin offering a slow response while their local governments lie to them. What they can see with their eyes overrides the propaganda being put out by Russia's defense ministry. And that pressure from Putin's own people is being reflected in pressure applied by his political allies. In September 2024, a Russian member of parliament named Yevgeny Fedorov struck back at the Kremlin's official propaganda, which continues to claim that Russia has the Ukrainian invasion under control. Fedorov leads Russia's national liberation movement and is a key voice in arguing for the territorial integrity of the Russian state. The Kursk governor announced that 10 more villages have been evacuated. If there is no offensive, why evacuate the villages? Fedorov asked in a Telegram post. The same question could be asked for Belgorod. If Russia has that invasion under control, then why is it proclaiming a state of emergency in the oblast? The reason is that Putin is trying to relieve the pressure. Fedorov also cited Kremlin propaganda, claiming that the invasions were the last dash from the grave for Ukraine's forces, marking the comments as ridiculous, while pointing out that Kurchatov, which is a city in Kursk that lies 70 miles away from Ukraine's border, has been closed. Again, why do that if there's no threat of Ukraine attacking the city? It all adds up to more pressure being placed on Putin. The Kremlin is trying to lie its way out of the invasion, telling the Russian people to ignore the very real evidence of an invasion that's before their very eyes. With the second invasion into Belgorod, Ukraine is making it even harder for the Kremlin to spread its lies, allowing it to chip away at Putin's power base in his own country in the process. Putin's inability to defend his own people is being exposed. And that brings us to another reason why Ukraine has launched an attack on Belgorod. It's showing the world that Russia's military isn't as powerful as Putin would like to have people believe. Ingram points this out in his interview with Times Radio. Given the fact that Ukrainians attacked Belgorod twice in the last year, the Russians should have been more prepared for an attack there, he says, referencing the Ukrainian strikes that took place earlier in 2024. If the Ukrainians make significant advances, it shows that the Russians are in a much worse state than we'd thought beforehand. This is an important point. Putin's position as Russia's president is predicated on his ability to project a strongman image to both his people and the rest of the world. That image was holding up pretty well before the Ukraine war and into its early months. The concept of red lines, which are the lines Ukraine's allies believe they couldn't cross because they would provoke Russian aggression, became a hot topic. Fear was the name of Putin's game. Russia was one of the world's largest militaries. The narrative went, and Ukrainians should keep away if they don't want to feel its full force. The problem for Putin is that the Kursk and Belgorod invasions represent the last red line that Ukraine could cross. It's already receiving weapons from Western allies. It has permission to use many of those weapons inside Russia. Ukraine even has F-16s. Now it's fighting Russian soldiers inside Russia, taking territory as it does. And Putin has yet to muster a proper response. Never mind unleash the level of military aggression most believe would come. Now the red lines have shifted once again. Russia, and Putin by proxy, is still trying to position itself as a major threat. As recently as September 4th, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told reporters that the U.S. has found itself being egged on by Zelensky, that they should understand they are joking about red lines here. They shouldn't joke about our red lines. But most of those red lines have already been crossed. Putin has done nothing about it, which only lends credence to the prevailing thought that, for all of Russia's might on paper, its military is poorly trained and far less capable than many believed. After all, this is a military that's losing around 1,000 people per day in Donetsk to take small scraps of territory while, to Ukraine's north, it's losing a lot more ground on its own turf. And that brings us to another reason that Ukraine has launched its Belgorod invasion. It gives Putin something to think about. That was one of the main reasons behind the Kursk invasion. After all, Putin has diverted at least 30,000 troops to that region in an effort to get rid of the Ukrainian invaders. The number may even be as high as 60,000. According to Zelensky, who told NBC News at the beginning of September that the idea and one of the goals of the Kursk Oblast operation was diverting Russian troops to their territory. The Belgorod invasion likely has similar goals. Zelensky is stretching the front lines of the war, pulling them into Russian territory to relieve the pressure his forces are feeling in Donetsk. Whether that strategy is going to work remains to be seen. But if nothing else, the Belgorod invasion gives Putin yet another thing to think about while he's still struggling to deal with the Kursk invasion. He now has to fight Ukrainians in 2 Russian territories, forcing changes in strategy that he didn't want to make. And all of this brings us to the final reason Ukraine launched the Belgorod invasion. By moving into Russian territory, Zelensky has snatched the initiative of the Ukraine war out of Putin's hands. That's according to Ingram, who noted the initiative issue when referring to a series of missile and drone strikes that killed 4 people during Ukraine's Independence Day on August 24th. Ingram says that part of the reason for launching those attacks was for Putin to try and say to the Russian people and his international supporters that he still has the initiative when, in reality, he doesn't, because the Ukrainians have regained it via their attacks in Kursk and elsewhere. For perhaps the first time since the Ukraine war began, Putin has been forced into a reactive mode, where he's trying to deal with Ukrainian attacks rather than being the aggressor. You could argue that he entered that mode during the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, though the key difference there comes in advanced warning. Putin knew the counteroffensive was being planned. He had months to prepare as a result, but he had no idea that Kursk was coming, and now, with Belgorod being invaded, he's been caught off guard again. Even as Russia continues to bombard Donetsk, it's Ukraine that holds more of the cards in this conflict. Still, there are issues that Ukraine has to consider going forward. Speaking to NBC News on September 3rd, Zelensky said that Ukraine plans to hold the territory it's taken in Kursk. "We don't need their land. We don't want to bring our Ukrainian way of life there," Zelensky said before saying, "For now, we need it as part of his push toward a victory plan." You have to assume he will take the same approach to any land that Ukraine captures in Belgorod. The ongoing challenge for the Ukrainian army will lie in ensuring that it has enough soldiers in place to keep the territory it's taken. There's a possibility that Zelensky may stretch his own forces too thin while attempting to force Putin to do the same. After all, Ingram believes that Ukraine has already reached its limit of exploitation within Russia, meaning it's reached the limit of the amount of territory it can take in Kursk and Belgorod with the number of soldiers it has in the country. To take more, Zelensky will have to send additional troops. He'll also need to replenish the numbers of those lost to Russian counteroffensives. Given that Russia is still trying to progress in Donetsk, that could place Ukraine in the dangerous position of trying to hold Kursk and Belgorod while it's losing land elsewhere. Still, for now at least, Putin has once again been left with egg on his face. The Kursk invasion showed that Russia's military was woefully unprepared for the mere concept of Ukraine launching an attack on Russian territory. With Belgorod, Ukraine has not only wrested the initiative further out of Putin's hands, but it has shown his inability to adapt. Putin was caught unaware for a second time. Will there be a third? A fourth? How many times will the Russian people put up with a leader who has repeatedly shown that he has no plan in place to defend them against the consequences of his own aggression? Let us know your thoughts and the answers to those questions in the comment section, along with any thoughts you have about what Ukraine's next step should be. Now go and check out how Ukraine's invasion of Russia changed everything, or click this other video instead.